This is the first published paper within professional boxing that reveals why doing more road work may not be the answer to improving your boxing conditioning. It is authored by Andrew Usher and Dr. John Babrai. If you go back to the Sweet Science of Fighting podcast, I've interviewed Andrew Usher twice and once with Dr. John Babrai, and they actually dive into a lot of what was done and published in this study in those podcasts. But I'm going to break down this study for you and give you the practical aspects of it and how you can implement that into your training so you're not done spinning your wheels doing endless road work and not seeing that transfer to your boxing. Now, this paper is titled The Use of NERS to Explore Skeletal Muscle Oxygenation During Different Training Sessions in Professional Boxing. If you're not sure what a bunch of that gibberish means, don't worry, I'm going to break this down in the video. But first, of course, make sure to please like and subscribe, it helps the channel, and I want to keep making these informational videos for you. So yes, road work does have its time and place, but it should not be the thing that is driving your boxing conditioning. So I'm going to break down the study for you, and you can see why. So just to give you an overview of how the study was done, there was 10 professional boxers out of Scotland. They went through 3 different sessions, a heavy bag session, a pad work session, and a sparring session. And these are all done for the same work to rest ratios, 6 sets of 3 minutes with 1 minute recovery. Now, these bag and pad sessions were done at their normal pace. So however they normally do their bag and pad sessions was how it was done in the study. And then same thing with sparring. So there were no interventions done in the study to try manipulate a certain outcome. It was just monitoring what was already happening. Now, during these sessions, a NERS device or a mainstream technological device that you may recognize as the Moxie monitor. If not, you can search that up. Essentially, it measures the muscle's oxygen saturation and desaturation during exercise. As we exercise, the muscle uses oxygen. We talk about that a lot when we talk about conditioning, and this device measures that within the muscle. So we're able to get a very clear picture of how the muscle is working throughout these different sessions and how it is recovering with these different sessions. Further, heart rate was also tracked during these sessions, so you can see the relationship between heart rate and what's happening at the muscular level. So if you understand some basic conditioning principles and stuff we've talked about on the podcast and other videos, we have central and peripheral adaptations, peripheral being muscular and central being at the heart. So we can see heart rate, more central side of the conditioning, and we can use the Moxie for the more peripheral side responses to these different modalities. And the Moxie monitor was placed on the rectus femoris, which is one of the quadricep muscles. Now you might be wondering, okay, boxing, upper body, why wasn't it placed there? Well, the lower body is heavily involved in boxing, as we know that the hardest punches have the greatest contributions from the legs. We know what it looks like when someone is an upper body puncher, so the legs are heavily involved in all of these exercises. So from the Moxie monitor, this is what the graph looks like. And I'm gonna break down each section for you so you can understand what is going on through this and the conclusions from the study. So the first portion at the very beginning, the onset of exercise, we have the initial delay. Kind of looks like this, just almost like a flat line or a slight rise in the line. It represents that the muscular work being done is not enough to activate the mitochondria any further. So the mitochondria within our muscles, that's our powerhouse. That is what uses the oxygen to create energy for our muscles. Now, the muscular work being done is not enough to increase the activation of the mitochondria, so it's just using what it already has. So there's enough oxygen for you to sustain that intensity. Now, as the rounds go on, this initial delay increases or is extended. So instead of that short line here, this line might come out here before we start seeing that drop. Now, the problem with this is it's where the mitochondria can't handle all this extra oxygen being delivered, and we have an impaired mitochondrial activation. So our mitochondria aren't activating early enough to use this oxygen, and we get this delay. The problem is we want the mitochondria to work as efficiently as possible to start converting or using the oxygen and creating energy. We then get into a fast oxygen desaturation portion of the graph. Now, it represents where the oxygen use within the muscle increases past what is being delivered through the blood. Now, the problem is because there's not enough oxygen being delivered, the mitochondria end up using the oxygen that is within the muscle stores or the muscle reserves. The problem is if you think about this like if you've ever played Tekken, Mortal Kombat, where you have your life bar that life bar diminishes over time. And as you go round to round to round, you start with less and less life. And eventually that starts to run out. And the problem becomes intensity is reduced from round to round. You don't recover as fast and you don't recover as much between rounds. And what they found within the study is regardless of the type of or modality of boxing used, this was the case where as they go to their later rounds, they weren't able to recover well enough. We then have the equilibrium part or portion of this graph. This is where it's a balance between oxygen use and delivery. Think of it as within a round or something, you kind of feel like you're in gear and you can continue going at a similar pace. Now, there is some variation between the bags and the pad compared to sparring. Bags and pad tend to have a relatively straight line within equilibrium. Within sparring, there's a lot more variation and it becomes harder to find this within sparring. Obviously, you're dealing with an opponent and a lot of things going on, so there's a lot more. So this could potentially indicate why bag and pad work may not transfer well to sparring, and that's why you need to do a lot of sparring to be able to get quote unquote boxing fit. But there is also more to this, and we'll continue going through this graph and more of the findings. We finally have the resaturation period of this graph, so being able to resaturate more oxygen back into the muscle. So essentially mitochondrial activity is reduced so that the muscle can reoxygenate. We don't want the mitochondria to use that oxygen, we want the muscle to resaturate with oxygen so we can recover between rounds. However, as we go through more and more rounds, this resaturation rate starts to diminish. So instead of seeing a line that might come up like this, we may take longer to recover. And then as you can see, what can happen is over time, if you go from round to round to round, starting at a lower start point, for example here, and then here, as an example, you can see how it can accumulate fatigue between rounds. And if you're not recovering well between rounds, you start at a lower and lower point where intensity is reduced, you aren't able to throw enough power shots, you aren't able to recover well, you start to gas. So I'm gonna take you through a few more important findings in this study that you can use practically within your training, and how this graph and how these findings relate to these other findings. So what's interesting about this study is they also counted the punches thrown within all of the rounds. And they found that punch count didn't change, even though a lot of these markers did. So for example, the resaturation rates of oxygen, we talked about that just previously with the recovery, the reduction of mitochondrial activity to increase muscular oxygenation. And they found that over the rounds, this started to diminish. However, punch count did not. So the muscles weren't recovering, but punch count was still the same. This indicates that punch count potentially isn't an indicator of work capacity, as muscles are not recovering even though the same amount of punches are being thrown. Secondly, heart rate recovery may not be an indicator of recovery since it doesn't indicate muscle recovery. So while there is a small reduction in heart rate between rounds, obviously we see that muscle recovery is still impeded. Now, even though heart rate is still relatively high at the start of each round, which means there's a lot of blood being pumped to the muscles, which means a lot of oxygen is being pumped to the muscles still aren't able to use that oxygen, even though there's a surplus of it. This indicates again that muscular recovery is impeded more so than what is happening at the central level, which is why road work may not be a way to improve your conditioning, because when we're doing low intensity steady state cardio like road work, we are predominantly targeting central adaptations at the heart. Now, maybe the heart and the central responses are not the limiting factor that are causing us to gas out in boxing. Potentially, based on this research paper, it is the muscular recovery that is the issue. So how do we address these peripheral adaptations and improve muscle recovery between rounds and within a fight? A very effective method is to use sprint interval training, and you'll hear Andrew Usher talk about that a lot on those podcasts. I highly urge you to join the Sweet Science Fighting Underground. He has this whole sprint interval training PDF document in there that gives some protocols. Also, all of the Dominate the Mats, Dominate the Ring, and Dominate the Cage strength and conditioning programs have been updated to 2.0 versions. with some of this research moved into that, especially around the idea of sprint interval training, spending a little more time at the high intensity ranges. Now, why do we want to train at these short, high intensity bursts? It's because we can predominantly target these peripheral adaptations within the muscle. They can become more fatigue resistant, they can recover faster between efforts because they've developed that ability to resaturate with oxygen between rounds. And therefore, we are also improving mitochondrial activity within that. What does a sprint interval session look like? It could be 10-second sprints on a spin bike, for example, anywhere from 10 to 20 seconds of rest. Does that mean this is all you do as a boxer? No. There's always a time and a place for most training modalities over a training cycle or a training year. You may start very polarized. You may start with some of your lower intensity work and very high intensity sprint intervals with longer rest. As you work your way through those, maybe closer towards a fight, a smoke, or whatever it is, you might start to employ more of these sprint intervals with less rest. So we're looking at 10, 15, 20 second sprints, and we're looking at anywhere from 10 to 20 seconds of rest. Again, I urge you to listen to those podcasts with Andrew Usher. He actually spells out some of these protocols in there. So I'm hoping I was able to make that research paper a little easier to understand for you. Please let me know in the comments if it is still very confusing. I'm just trying to explain it in a way where anyone can understand it. It is a little more scientific and harder to break down, but hopefully you get the gist of what I'm trying to say here and what the paper is trying to get across to you. But make sure you check the description. The link to the Sweet Science of Fighting Underground is there. The updated training programs, the private community, the online courses are all there. Please make sure to like, subscribe, share the video, comment below if this is new information for you, if it helps you in any way, and if this still made sense. If it didn't, ask your questions in the comments. I can make sure they get answered.